Hello and welcome to the interview here on France 24. My guest today is Lobsang Sangay, who is the head of the Tibetan government in exile. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me, Mark.
This year marks the 60th anniversary of the departure of your spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, into exile. This is when China took control of Tibet back in 1959. Like many Tibetans, he eventually settled in neighboring India, where you were born. Obviously, the Dalai Lama has become the embodiment of the Tibetan cause for decades, but in 2011, he relinquished his political power to focus on spiritual matters. There was an election, and you won that election. You were then re-elected. Very obvious questions after 60 years, and with China's rising economic and diplomatic clout, many people, many observers think that the dream of Tibetan autonomy is as far away as it's ever been.
I think I would disagree with that, because if you look at 1950s and 60s, when our country, Tibet, was occupied, many wrote us off, and especially in 60s and 70s, especially 70s, hardly anyone talked about Tibet. But then since late 80s and 90s, the fact that, it's been 60 years, today I'm still standing here in your studio and then traveling around the world speaking about Tibet means we are still alive, we are still standing. The fight for our truth and justice is still on. So yes, China is rising in its influence, you can sense it, but at the same time...
Do you sense it? When you travel, for instance, do you sense the influence on China in the behavior of foreign leaders who might be willing to preserve their ties with China and therefore not meet with you?
Yes, I can sense it. There are some who shy away from meeting you. There's some who shy away from speaking about Tibet, and then Chinese government condition. Nowadays, if you sign a free trade with, let's say, or Norway or Denmark, any European countries, they put a condition not to talk about three T's, Tibet, Taiwan, and Tiananmen Square. You can clearly sense it. But at the same time, there's a bit of a backlash or a buyer's remorse. Because if you go to Australia, now they have put a bill in the parliament to prevent or constrain foreign influence, particularly China's influence. So that is also happening. Hence, there is a growing element in the international community because China is growing. They want to know what is China, and hence Tibetan narrative is very relevant and very important. So there is a new audience that's coming, and that's where we have to take advantage of and be out there in the international community.
But do you fear that even in countries where you or the spiritual leader, the Dalai Lama, was received, let's say the United States, he's been received regularly in the White House, there might also be a change? There were some concerns that the Trump administration had decided not to fund assistance to Tibet, which would be a major reversal. We haven't heard Donald Trump on the issue, unlike his predecessors. Could that herald maybe a bad turn for your cause in the United States?
Ultimately, Tibetan cause is Tibetan people's cause. As long as you are fighting, you're preserving identity and pursuing your goal, that will determine the outcome. So Tibet, inside Tibet and outside Tibet, the sense of unity and solidarity very strong. And as far as President Trump with these allocation of fund for Tibet and Tibet-related projects, there's a bit of a misunderstanding because the Tibet-related funding has often come from the Congress side. So I know both in the House and the Senate, the draft bill that they have of appropriation, they had the language is the funding should be given no less than last year. So if the budget is negotiated, we will get the same amount of funding like last year.
But because of Congress. But do you fear that in the White House there's someone who is not as favorable to your cause than his predecessors?
Now, from my sense in Washington, D.C. is, they will be quite hawkish on China as well lately. President Donald Trump in the White House has imposed 30% tariff on solar panel and refrigerator, and which was clearly targeting China. Similarly, of course, there are always elements in the White House and U.S. government or any other government, but now there's a growing realization that China is a competition and they have to deal about China. And hence, the Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, the U.S. ambassador to China, all have raised issues, all have raised Tibet issue with the Chinese counterparts.
But you would hope to see it more at the forefront.
Definitely, we hope that President Trump will continue the past tradition of meeting with His Holiness Dalai Lama, because President Barack Obama met him 4 times, George W. Bush met him 4 times. So we hope that past tradition will continue, and we have reason to believe it will continue if His Holiness Dalai Lama goes to Washington, D.C.
Is there an invitation that you're waiting for?
Oh, it's never negotiated, talk publicly, yes.
Right. In Tibet, since Xi Jinping has arrived, clearly he is probably the most powerful Chinese leader in a long, long time. What is his policy vis-a-vis Tibet? Is he willing to negotiate anything? There have been, just for our viewers, negotiations between 2002 2010. Officially, yes. There haven't been negotiations since. Is there any hope that he might change, or does he want to fully control Tibet and not talk about autonomy at all?
If you look at Xi Jinping's term in the last 5 years, situation in Tibet at a micro level has gone from bad to worse. The destruction of Larungar Monastery from 12,000 monks and nuns to 5,000 monks and nuns, where 3 nuns committed suicide. And also Yachingar Nunnery, where 6,000 nuns are there. It's being demolished as we speak. And 151 Tibetans have committed self-immolation, burned themselves since 2011. And then the grid system, the securitization of Tibet, even the Freedom House Index shows that Tibet is the least free region after Syria. And Reporters Without Borders says that for journalists, getting access to Tibet is more difficult than North Korea. So clearly under Xi Jinping, the situation has gone from bad to worse.
So he doesn't want to negotiate, you think?
But we remain hopeful. As a Buddhist, we are perennially optimistic. That we are hopeful that in his second term, which will begin from March of this year, that he will relook at Tibet issue and realize that hardline policies does not work. And more Tibetans are protesting, and there's increasing resentment. Hence, the liberal policies should be implemented. And his father's good friend, Hu Yabang, had a very liberal approach towards the Tibetan issue.
Is this wishful thinking, or from your interactions, indirect, obviously, with the Chinese leadership, do you sense that they could shift? Because as you described, this is not the course right now.
As a Buddhist, we believe in impermanence,
No, but as a politician?
As a politician also, one should always remain hopeful. The ground reality shows more repression. But we still hope that Xi Jinping in his second term will look at Tibet as a low-hanging fruit and solve it.
Obviously, there is concern about the health of the Dalai Lama. He's announced that he's canceling his international trips, probably because he feels this is too tiring for him. And the question of his succession is always raised and how China will act. But I want to ask you, do you feel that the middle way approach, which was adopted, that is to seek autonomy and not independence, might be in jeopardy if China doesn't change course, if there is a succession fight, that some Tibetans might say, we've tried autonomy, it's not working, let's go for independence and maybe violence?
The violence is futile. I think middle way is the right approach.
Many groups or countries or regions are using violence to pursue their goals.
That's true, but we always feel we are the good guys. Our movement is a role model.
But the youth might become impatient, saying it's not working. There are groups like this already saying you're going nowhere.
That's true. There are youth who are saying it's not going anywhere, but no youth or student organization is advocating violence. It's futile, So we will pursue non-violence. Now, middle way approach is the policy to seek genuine autonomy for the Tibetan people inside China within the framework of the Chinese constitution. Now, White House have applauded and supported middle way approach, and here I am in European capitals, appealing to leaders to support middle way approach as well. In fact, related to France, the middle way approach is closely related to Strasbourg proposal. When His Holiness Dalai Lama came to European Parliament in Strasbourg, made this proposal in the Tibetan world. Strasbourg proposal is very well known. I hope the French government and leaders will take ownership, like a mother, and support Strasbourg proposal.
But just to conclude, this is clearly an example. The new president, Emmanuel Macron, back in September 2016, he met the Dalai Lama. He was not president. He was not even a candidate. Since then, he went to China, very important visit. He said, I'm not talking about human rights because it's not productive. And obviously, there's no plan, I guess, to meet the Dalai Lama. Previous French presidents have clearly avoided that, at least in public. So isn't this an illustration of the difficult situation you're in? People, when they're not in power, are very happy to have their picture taken with the Dalai Lama. Once in power, they forget about him and about Tibet.
No, the fact that President Macron met His Holiness Dalai Lama before shows, he's kind of person of conscience, is a good guy. But given the protocol position he is in, obviously there are complexities. We understand that.
If he says, I'm going to China every year, how do you expect him to defend your cause?
I hope he will use his office like, the former President Chirac and Mitterrand and influence Chinese government to negotiate on the Tibet issue because, Jacques Chirac and Mitterrand has played a crucial role in initiating the previous envoys of the Dalai Lama going to China and having dialogue with the Chinese counterparts. I hope President Macron in his annual visit to China will nudge Xi Jinping and play his role, and Strasbourg proposal, which has a French name, will have ownership and like a mother to a son, Tibet.
Okay. On those words of wisdom, thank you very much for coming on the France 24 interview, and thank you for watching it. Stay tuned for more news.